On a quiet evening, long after the great universities of Europe have closed their doors for the night, imagine a single lamp still burning in a narrow stone cell. The corridors are silent, the courtyard is dark, and only the faint scratch of a quill moves through the stillness. There, at a simple wooden desk, sits a large, calm figure in a white habit and black cloak, his gaze steady, his thoughts turning slowly toward God. This is Thomas, the quiet friar whom many will one day call a giant of the mind. Around him lie worn books of scripture and Aristotle, pages of notes, and questions that many fear to ask. Yet his heart is at peace. Tonight, we will walk softly through his life, from castle and cloister to classroom and chapel, and listen to the gentle way he allowed faith and reason to meet, not in conflict, but in a clear, steady light. There is a softness to the memories of childhood, even when they belong to a man whose name will one day fill heavy books and echo in great lecture halls. Before St. Thomas Aquinas was a scholar, before he was a friar, he was simply a child, moving between stone walls and open skies, between the echoing corridors of a castle and the quiet paths of a monastery garden. He was born around the year 1225 in the family castle of Roccasecca, a stronghold of stone perched above the countryside of southern Italy. The house of Aquinas was noble, accustomed to the language of politics and alliances, of land and power. Yet, beneath the high ceilings and along the stone stairways, there were also the small, ordinary sounds of family life, the footsteps of servants, the murmur of conversations, the laughter or cries of children. In that setting, the infant Thomas was carried from room to room, wrapped in simple cloth, unaware of the expectations into which he had been born. His father, Landulf, was a count, and his mother, Theodora, came from a noble line as well. To many around them, it would have seemed obvious. This boy would one day take his place among the powerful families of his time, perhaps in the service of a king, perhaps as abbot of a great monastery, a position of honor that would suit the family's status. But the child himself, as he grew, knew nothing of such plans. He knew only the world that unfolded before his eyes, the rough texture of the castle walls beneath his fingers, the patterns of sunlight moving across the courtyard stones, the sight of hills and fields fading gently into the distance. Perhaps he watched the changing shapes of the clouds above Roccasecca, wondering silently about their paths across the sky. The Aquinas family had a long connection with the Benedictine Abbey of Monte Cassino, which rose on its mountain not far from their lands. Founded centuries earlier by Saint Benedict, Monte Cassino was a place where prayer and work, study and silence were woven into the rhythm of each day. It was also a place where noble families sometimes sent their sons for education and often for a path to high office in the church. When Thomas was still quite young, his parents chose to send him there. They hoped that, in time, he might rise to become abbot, a role that would bring honor both to him and to their name. And so, the child who had wandered the castle halls, listening to the sounds of guards and servants, found himself entering a different kind of building, one made for prayer, for learning, and for a quieter kind of strength. The journey from Roccasecca to Monte Cassino would have taken him along winding roads, past fields and villages, ever closer to the mountain on which the abbey stood. Perhaps he sat on a small horse or rode in a cart, the world passing slowly by, his young eyes observing details that he would never later speak of, but that shaped his inner sense of the world. A lonely tree by the roadside, a shepherd with his flock, a row of cypress trees pointing upward toward the sky. Each small scene left its trace in the mind of a boy who, even then, was thoughtful and reserved. When he reached Monte Cassino, the abbey would have seemed vast and solemn. High walls, strong towers, and within them, a community of men in black habits who moved with a steady, deliberate calm. Bells marked the hours. The brothers gathered in the choir to chant the psalms, their voices rising and falling in patterns Thomas had not heard before. There were no loud markets here, no clatter of armor, no busy courtly entertainments. Only the measured life of prayer, reading, work, and rest. For many children, such a place might have felt confining or severe. But for Thomas, something about the ordered quiet seems to have fit his nature. Even as a child, he was serious and gentle, not given to noisy games or shouting. It is said that he was quiet to the point of being misunderstood, that his silence was sometimes mistaken for dullness. Yet those who watched him more closely noticed a different kind of energy. He listened intently, watched with care, and once a thought took hold in his mind, he did not soon let it go. In the Abbey school, he began to learn his letters, to read the Psalms, to take his first steps into the world of learning. The monks, experienced teachers of boys, would have guided him patiently through basic grammar, the patterns of Latin, the stories of Scripture. In the classroom, the sound of voices reciting lessons would blend with the faint rustling of parchment and the distant echo of footsteps in the corridor outside. It was here, according to a long tradition, that Thomas asked a question that would echo throughout his life. The story tells that he turned to one of his teachers and asked simply, "What is God?" It is a small sentence, just 3 words put together, but it reveals something deep about the child who spoke it. He was not satisfied merely to hear that God existed or to learn prayers by heart. He wanted to know, in the most profound and simple way, who this God was, what it meant to say that God is. One can imagine the scene, a classroom with wooden benches, shafts of daylight entering through narrow windows, dust motes turning softly in the air. A quiet boy, surrounded by other students who may have been more restless or distracted, raises his voice not to show off, not to argue, but to ask a question that carries a whole lifetime of seeking within it. The monk who heard it may not have realized at that moment that, in this child, a future theologian was beginning to awaken. Life at Monte Cassino was not all books and questions. The young Thomas would have joined the monks at prayer, standing in the choir as they sang the Psalms. The rhythms of the liturgy, the repetition of sacred words, the slow unfolding of the day from matins to vespers shaped his inner world. While the older monks read from heavy volumes, the boy watched and listened, learning not only from the words, but from the calm, persistent devotion that filled the abbey. Outside, the monastery gardens offered another kind of learning. Perhaps Thomas walked under the shadow of ancient walls, past herbs and fruit trees, listening to the wind move through branches or to the steady drip of water in a stone basin. These simple sounds, combined with the patience of the monks at their work, taught him something about contemplation that no argument could fully express. The world, he might have sensed, is orderly and meaningful, not random or chaotic. There is a quiet wisdom in its structure, a goodness that invites reflection. Back home, in the castle of Roccasecca, his parents and relatives imagined a future in which their son would become an influential abbot, a man of the church who also served the interests of his family. From their perspective, Monte Cassino was a path to honor and stability. For Thomas, however, it was becoming something more, not just a step toward a position, but a school of the soul, teaching him to listen, to question, and to seek God with both heart and mind. The world outside the monastery was unsettled. The 13th century was a time of conflict between emperors and popes, of shifting alliances and political tensions. Even in the quiet of Monte Cassino, echoes of these struggles would occasionally reach the monks, as messengers passed through or news arrived from afar. Yet, for the child Thomas, much of this would have remained distant and indistinct. His days were filled with smaller, steadier things: the next lesson to read, the next psalm to sing, the next question to ponder. We do not know every detail of his childhood years. The sources that reach us across the centuries are selective, preserving only what seemed most significant to those who wrote them. They tell us that Thomas was serious, that he loved study, that he was drawn to silence and contemplation. They hint at his early love for the things of God, at a mind already moving slowly, carefully, like a deep river rather than a rushing stream. Perhaps some evenings, the boy would stand at a window or walk in a cloister as the light faded over the surrounding hills. The stone of the abbey would grow cool around him, and the first stars would appear above the darkening landscape. Somewhere in the building, a bell would ring, calling the community together again. As he turned toward the chapel, he carried within him questions that even he could not fully name, questions that would one day grow into careful arguments, ordered treatises, and pages upon pages of patient thought. Yet for now, he was still just Thomas, a child of noble birth, living among monks, quietly attentive to the world around him. The expectations of his family and the wider plans of God for his life were still hidden. All that was visible was a thoughtful boy, moving between the solid walls of a castle and the holy halls of a monastery, learning how to pray, how to read, and how to wonder about the one whose name he had learned to pronounce with reverence. In these early years, the foundations were laid. The balance of castle and cloister, of noble heritage and monastic discipline, gave shape to a life that would later seek to hold together many things that others saw as opposites: faith and reason, scripture and philosophy, heaven and earth. The child who once asked, "What is God?" would, in time, become a man who devoted his entire life to exploring that mystery. But the beginning was simple, quiet, and slow, like the turning of pages in a dimly lit scriptorium, or the regular tolling of a bell over a peaceful valley, marking the hours of a boyhood that silently prepared the way for all that was to come. In time, the boy who had learned his first letters in the shadow of Monte Cassino began to outgrow the simple lessons of childhood. The monks who had watched him progress through the basics of grammar and scripture could see that his mind reached further. His questions were not the passing curiosities of a restless child, but the steady inquiries of someone who wished to understand, layer by layer, what lay beneath the surface of things. The quiet student was ready for a wider world, yet that wider world did not at first mean distant countries or great journeys. It began with books, with broader studies, and with the decision of his family to direct his path. The political tensions of Italy and the struggles between empire and papacy reached even to Monte Cassino, making it less secure as a place of education. And so, around his mid-teens, Thomas was sent to the city of Naples, where a relatively new university had taken root. The move from the mountain abbey to the bustling streets of Naples must have felt like stepping into another universe. The city, open to the sea, was full of merchants, sailors, scholars, and students. Markets rang with voices, the air carried the smell of spices and sea salt, and the narrow streets twisted between houses and churches, leading to squares where people gathered to talk and argue. After the ordered calm of monastic life, Naples presented Thomas with a different kind of rhythm, faster, louder, more varied. He enrolled at the University of Naples, founded by the emperor as a place to train administrators and officials loyal to his rule. There, the courses of study included not only theology and the liberal arts, but also subjects that would be useful for public life: law, rhetoric, and philosophy. As the young Aquinas took his place among the students, he was no longer just a boy among monks. He was a learner among many, each with their own ambitions and hopes. In the classroom, the air was thick with ideas. Teachers expounded on grammar, logic, and the works of earlier thinkers. It was here that Thomas encountered more fully the writings of Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher whose works were gradually resurfacing in Western Europe through translations, often from Arabic sources. Aristotle spoke of causes and motion, of the nature of the soul, of ethics, of the structure of reality. For some, these writings seemed like a challenge, even a threat, to traditional Christian teaching. For others, they were tools that could deepen understanding. For Thomas, they were something to be studied patiently, carefully, without haste or fear. The calm steadiness he had learned at Monte Cassino shaped the way he approached these new texts. While some students might have been drawn to the excitement of novelty, or to debates marked by sharp words and quick judgments, Thomas's style remained more measured. He listened, read, questioned, and slowly sifted what he learned, looking for what was true and good in it, and how it might fit within the larger horizon of faith. Outside the classroom, he walked the streets of Naples, perhaps passing churches where the faithful prayed quietly in side chapels, or pausing to watch ships rocking gently in the harbor. The contrast between the noise of the city and the interior stillness that had begun to grow in him became a kind of training. He was learning, without fully realizing it, how to keep a clear, ordered space within his mind and heart, even when the world around him was full of movement and confusion. The noble expectations of his family still hung over his life, like a cloak he had not yet either fully accepted or cast aside. His parents likely imagined that his studies in Naples would prepare him for a respectable career in the service of the emperor or the church. To them, education was not an end in itself, but a pathway toward influence and stability. Thomas, however, was beginning to sense that knowledge had a different flavor for him. It was not simply a tool, it was a way of drawing closer to the truth, and through truth, to God. At the university, he encountered members of a relatively new religious order, the Order of Preachers, founded by Saint Dominic. These friars, unlike monks who lived in enclosed monasteries, moved through cities and universities, preaching, teaching, and living in community while remaining close to the people. They wore simple white habits with black cloaks and lived on alms. Their mission was to preach the gospel with clarity, to combat confusion and error by teaching patiently and well. The Dominicans in Naples impressed Thomas. Their life combined study and prayer, contemplation and action, in a way that resonated deeply with the path that was quietly forming in his own heart. He saw men who loved learning, not for prestige, but as a means of serving others. He saw a simplicity in their way of life, a poverty freely embraced, that contrasted with the noble privileges he had known as a child. The harmony between contemplation and preaching, between the silence of study and the spoken word of teaching, drew him in. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a desire awakened in him, the desire to join this order, to become a Dominican friar. It was not a choice made in a moment of excitement, but a decision that settled over him gradually, like evening light across a landscape. He saw that this path would mean leaving behind certain expectations, stepping away from the secure plans others had made for him. It would mean embracing a life of poverty, chastity, obedience, and study in service of the gospel. In those days in Naples, one can imagine him returning from his lectures to a quiet room, books spread before him, reflecting on what he had heard. The voices of the city might drift faintly through the window. Distant conversations, the clatter of hooves on stone, the cry of a vendor. Yet his attention was turned inward, toward that subtle but insistent question, "What is God asking of me?" The same child who had once asked, "What is God?" was now beginning to ask, "What does God desire for my life?" The decision to join the Dominicans was not a simple matter. Thomas knew that his family, especially his mother, would not easily accept it. In the eyes of many noble families, the new mendicant orders, the Dominicans and Franciscans, were not the most desirable paths for their sons. These friars owned no property, held no lands, and did not promise the kind of worldly prestige that an abbacy or high ecclesiastical office might offer. For a count's son to join them could seem like stepping down from a carefully built ladder. And yet, the more Thomas learned, the more he studied, the clearer the path became. The University of Naples, with its mix of imperial influence and intellectual energy, had shown him something, that knowledge and power are not the same, and that the deepest gifts of the mind can be offered in humility, not held as instruments of ambition. The Dominicans embodied this insight in their way of life. Their cell walls held no portraits of ancestors, no signs of nobility, only books, a crucifix, a simple bed, and the tools of study and prayer. The quiet student from Roccasecca, sharpened by years at Monte Cassino and Naples, was preparing himself for a gentle but resolute act of freedom. Before he could take that step, however, he continued to deepen his studies. He worked through the texts of the liberal arts, grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These disciplines taught him how to think clearly, how to distinguish one idea from another, how to follow an argument patiently to its conclusion. He also began to explore philosophy more deeply, questions of being and essence, of causality, of the human soul. Sitting at a desk with parchment and ink, he traced lines of reasoning that would, in time, mature into the much more elaborate structures of his later works. But even now, one can see the outline of his distinctive style. He did not rush to condemn opposing views. He tried to understand them, to see why they might attract attention or belief, and then to respond to them calmly, step by step. During these years, his body also continued to grow. Accounts from later in his life describe him as large, even heavy, moving with a certain slowness. It is not hard to imagine that this physical presence was already noticeable in Naples. A tall, broad-shouldered young man who spoke little, who seemed absorbed in thought. Some, seeing his quiet manner and deliberate movements, may have mistaken him for simple-minded. Others, more perceptive, sensed that behind his silence, a deep and steady intelligence was at work. In the evenings, after the day's classes and obligations, Thomas might have sought out the Dominicans again, spending time in their chapel or speaking quietly with one of the friars. Questions about vocation are rarely settled by a single conversation. They unfold over time, in repeated encounters, in moments of prayer, in the slow alignment of desire and clarity. The flicker of lamps on stone walls, the scent of wax and old wood, the murmur of psalms. These small, sensory details formed the background to one of the most important choices of his life. Within his heart, the tension between family expectations and his growing attraction to the Dominican way became more defined. Yet even this tension did not erupt dramatically. It remained for the moment an interior struggle, known perhaps only to a few trusted confidants. The same patience that governed his study also governed his discernment. He did not act impulsively, but he did not ignore the call either. Thus, the period of Thomas's life as a student in Naples was a bridge. On one side lay the world of childhood and early monastic schooling. On the other side, the life of a friar, a teacher, and a theologian. Naples gave him a taste of the world's diversity and noise, while also introducing him to a community in which his love of study and his desire for a life given wholly to God could be brought together. The quiet student walked through crowded streets with a calm that came not from indifference, but from a deepening focus. Soon, the time would come when this focus would lead him to a choice that would surprise his family and shape the rest of his days. For now, he remained in the classrooms and libraries of Naples, a young man with notebooks full of careful script, with a mind nourished by Aristotle and Scripture, and with a heart that slowly and steadily was turning toward the black and white habit of the order of preachers. The city around him continued in its restless movement, but within him, something firm and clear was taking shape, like the first lines of an answer to a question that had been waiting since childhood. There comes a moment in many lives when a quiet conviction, long forming in secret, must finally show itself in the light of day. For Thomas Aquinas, that moment arrived in Naples, beneath the southern sky, among the stones and streets where he had come as a student. The path that had stretched softly before him since childhood, the path that wound from Roccasecca to Monte Cassino and then to the university, was about to bend sharply. And though he walked with his familiar calm, this turn would stir storms in the hearts of those who loved him. By now, Thomas had come to know the Dominicans not as distant figures, but as brothers, men whose daily life he could observe up close. He had seen them move along the streets in their white habits and black cloaks, begging humbly for alms, teaching in simple halls, kneeling in their chapels at dawn and dusk. He had heard their preaching, not shouted from a place of superiority, but spoken with a kind of interior clarity, as though the words rose from a well of prayer. He recognized in them a pattern that matched the deep rhythm of his own soul. Study joined to contemplation, contemplation flowing into teaching. This recognition did not flash through him in a single instant. It settled slowly, like a quiet rain, sinking into the soil of his heart. He knew what it would mean to join them. It would mean poverty instead of the wealth and security of his noble house. It would mean a simple cell instead of the comforts of a castle. It would mean a life of obedience, not to family expectations, but to the rule of an order whose only inheritance was the gospel. At last, he made his decision. He would ask to be received into the order of preachers. The friars of Naples, recognizing his character and ability, welcomed his desire. They clothed him in the white habit and black cloak, and Thomas Aquinas became Brother Thomas. The ceremony itself may have been modest: a few words, a habit placed upon his shoulders, a prayer. Yet for him, it marked a quiet but decisive break with the life others had planned for him. News of this choice traveled back to his family at Roccaseca. For his mother, Theodora, and for his brothers and relatives, it must have felt like a sudden wound. Their son, their younger brother, this noble young man whom they had imagined as an abbot or a powerful cleric, had chosen instead a life they considered beneath his station. To their eyes, he was throwing away his future, setting aside honor and influence for an existence they associated with begging and uncertain respect. They did not see what Thomas saw: the beauty of a life given freely, the dignity of humble study and preaching, the quiet joy of belonging entirely to God. They saw only a downward turn in the path they had laid out so carefully, and so they resolved to intervene. When the Dominicans in Naples learned that Thomas's family was deeply opposed to his decision, they realized that keeping him in the city would be dangerous. The Aquinas family was powerful and had allies who could easily reach Naples. The friars, wanting to protect their new brother, decided to send him away, hoping that distance would provide a shield. They planned to send him north, perhaps to Paris, where the order had strong houses and where Thomas could continue his studies in safety. Brother Thomas set out on the road with fellow friars, traveling northward. The road was long, passing through villages and countryside, with hills rising in the distance. One can imagine the quiet conversations among the friars, the soft clink of their belts, the rhythm of their footsteps on the earth. Brother Thomas, large and calm, walked alongside them, trusting in the path he believed God had opened for him. But his family was already moving. When word reached them that he had left Naples, they acted swiftly. Near the town of Aquino, close to the lands of his birth, his brothers and their armed men intercepted the small group of friars. The journey, which had begun in peace, was suddenly broken by the sound of horses, the rough voices of soldiers, the gleam of weapons. The friars could not resist such force. Thomas was taken from them, his Dominican habit standing in quiet contrast to the armor around him, and brought back under guard toward Roccaseca. For the first time in his life, the gentle student became a captive. The family castle, which had once been his childhood home, received him now as a prisoner. The thick stone walls, the heavy gates, the familiar views of hills and sky took on a different meaning. He was no longer a boy running along the corridors. He was a young friar, being prevented from living the vocation he had chosen. His mother hoped to persuade him gently. She spoke to him not as an enemy, but as a grieving parent, trying to turn him back from what she saw as a mistake. She reminded him of his noble birth, of the opportunities that lay before him if he would only follow the path she and his father had imagined. She pointed to the Benedictines of Monte Cassino, to the possibility of becoming abbot, of holding a position that combined religious life with honor and security. Thomas listened with respect. He loved his mother. He understood her fears and hopes. But within him, the clarity did not waver. God, he believed, was calling him to the Dominican order. The life she offered, dignified though it was, did not match the interior pattern he had come to recognize. His reply was simple and firm. He would remain a friar of the order of preachers. When gentle persuasion failed, the family tried another path. They decided to isolate him, keeping him under close watch in the castle. According to the accounts that have come down to us, this captivity lasted for more than a year. In those long months, Thomas's world shrank to the walls of his chamber and the limited spaces to which he was allowed to go. Yet his mind and heart did not shrink with them. He filled the enforced silence with reading, with prayer, and with reflection. It is said that he was allowed to keep some of his books, perhaps scripture, perhaps other texts he had studied in Naples. By the light of a small window or of a lamp, he continued to trace lines of thought across parchment, his large hand writing slowly, his mind following arguments and questions with the same calm attention as before. The castle that was meant to restrain him became, in a way, another school of patience and interior freedom. His family, still determined, tried more than words and confinement. One story, passed down through tradition, tells of a more subtle and painful test. It is said that his brothers, hoping to break his resolve, arranged for a woman to be brought secretly into his room, intending to lure him away from his vow of chastity and from his chosen path. The tale describes how, upon realizing what had been done, Thomas seized a burning brand from the fireplace and drove her away, marking a cross on the door or wall as a sign of his resolve. According to tradition, he then knelt in prayer, and from that night forward, he received a special grace of purity, symbolized in later stories as a heavenly girdle or belt given to him by angels. However one understands this account, its essence points to a deeper truth. In the quiet, hidden struggle of that captivity, Thomas's vocation was tested and strengthened. The opposition of his family, the temptations placed before him, the loneliness and uncertainty, all of these could have weakened his resolve, made him doubt his decision. Instead, they clarified it. In the stillness of his enforced seclusion, he chose again and again, in the depths of his heart, to belong to God as a Dominican friar. During this time, his sisters are said to have visited him. To them, he spoke more gently, explaining his reasons, sharing something of the peace he had found in his calling. They, in turn, came to respect his decision and to see, beyond family pride, the beauty of the path he had chosen. Quietly, almost invisibly, understanding began to spread through the family, though not without difficulty. Eventually, pressure from outside the castle joined the gentle persuasion within. The Dominicans, supported by the authority of the church, insisted that Thomas could not be held against his will. The legal and spiritual weight of their claim grew stronger. His mother, caught between love for her son and the expectations of nobility, found herself slowly moving toward acceptance. Perhaps she saw that his calm determination was not rebellion, but fidelity to a calling that had taken hold of his whole being. At last, a door opened. Whether by a carefully arranged release or by a more secret escape aided by his mother, as some traditions whisper, Thomas was allowed to leave Roccasecca and resume his path. He did not return to Monte Cassino, nor to a life of comfort and privilege. He returned to the Dominicans, to the simple habit he had chosen, to the life of poverty and study that had drawn him so deeply. When he left the castle this time, he was no longer the child who had once departed for the monastery school, nor the uncertain student who had arrived in Naples. He was a man whose vocation had been tested in the furnace of contradiction and sorrow. As he walked away from the heavy walls of Roccasecca, perhaps along a familiar road he had known as a boy, he carried with him a new kind of interior freedom. The knowledge that he had given himself wholly to the path he believed God had set before him, and that no human power, however strong, could truly take that away. The struggle between his decision and his family's plans did not leave him bitter. There is no trace in the stories that follow of resentment or harshness toward those who had opposed him. Instead, the experience seems to have deepened his capacity for understanding, for seeing how good intentions can sometimes clash with higher callings, and how love can be present even in painful resistance. This gentle insight later formed part of the calm tone of his teaching, in which he patiently explored not only truths, but also the reasons why others might find them difficult to accept. Soon, the order would send him further on his journey toward Paris and Cologne, toward new teachers and wider responsibilities. But the quiet battle at Roccasecca had already shaped something essential in him. The castle where he was once held had become, through grace, a place of inner liberation. The noble house that had hoped to direct his future had, unwittingly, helped to purify and strengthen it. The young friar who now took his place among the Dominicans again was the same Thomas in body, with his large frame and measured pace, his gentle silence and thoughtful gaze. Yet within him, the chords of vocation now rang more clearly. He knew what he had chosen and what he had left behind. He knew that the road ahead would ask much of him. Years of study, hours of prayer, a life of service. But he also knew, in a way that nothing could now shake, that he had not chosen alone. In the quiet center of his soul, the question of his path was settled. From this point onward, his life would unfold, not in the halls of a family castle, but in the lecture rooms of universities, the cloisters of friaries, and the chapels where he would kneel in long, silent prayer. The struggle with his family's plans, painful though it had been, had given him a gift. The strength to hold fast to a calling that would one day bear fruit in pages of luminous thought, and in a serenity that drew others closer to the God he had sought since childhood. When Thomas left the familiar landscapes of his childhood and the troubled peace of Roccasecca behind, he stepped into a world shaped more by books and questions than by stone walls and family ties. The order sent him north, across roads that crossed rivers and plains, toward places where the air was cooler and the language carried different sounds. His destination was the intellectual heart of Europe, first Paris, then Cologne, where one of the great minds of the age was quietly at work. Paris in the 13th century was a city of students and masters, a place where ideas seemed to gather like birds along the roofs and in the cloisters. The university there, already famous, drew men from many lands: Italy, England, Germany, Spain, each bringing their own accents and concerns. The streets were often crowded with scholars in worn cloaks, with friars of different orders, with merchants and pilgrims. Bells from many churches chimed across the river and over the bridges, marking the passing of hours that were filled with study and debate. Into this living web of thought came Brother Thomas, the large, quiet Dominican from southern Italy. He took his place among the students, blending into the background as he so often did. His size made him noticeable, but his manner did not. He did not seek attention, did not raise his voice in public quarrels, did not hurry toward the center of a crowd. Instead, he listened. He watched. He took notes with steady, careful script, filling pages with observations and questions. The university at Paris was not always a peaceful place. Disputes flared up about many things, about the rights of the masters, about the influence of the mendicant orders, about the place of Aristotle's works in Christian teaching. The writings of the Greek philosopher, translated first into Arabic and then into Latin, had opened vast horizons for reflection on nature, the soul, ethics, and metaphysics. Some welcomed these new tools eagerly. Others feared that they might undermine faith. In this atmosphere, the Dominicans believed that clear, deep thinking was more necessary than ever. They sent some of their brightest friars to study and teach at Paris, not to dominate, but to serve the Church with a mind enlightened by both faith and reason. Among these friars was a man whose own intellect shone like a steady flame, Albert of Cologne, known to later ages as Albert the Great. Albert was a German Dominican, a scholar whose curiosity ranged widely across fields we now call theology, philosophy, natural science, and more. He was not content with surface answers. He observed, experimented, and reflected. He walked through gardens and fields as well as libraries, noting the details of plants and animals, and then returned to his books to ponder what he had seen. He was a man whose love of God did not shrink from the complexity of the world. Instead, it embraced it as a way of understanding the Creator's wisdom more fully. Thomas was sent to study under Albert, first in Paris and eventually in Cologne, where Albert would teach for a time. The meeting of these two men, one already recognized as a great teacher, the other still unknown, quiet and large, a student among many, became a turning point in Thomas's life. In the classroom where Albert taught, students gathered around him, their parchments and ink ready, their minds alert. The halls were not grand in the way of royal palaces. They might have been simple rooms with wooden beams, narrow windows, and benches worn smooth by years of use. Yet within those walls, something rich unfolded each day. The careful unfolding of questions, the slow building of arguments, the patient exploration of truths that connected heaven and earth. Albert's teaching style combined clarity with depth. He did not rush. He laid out the positions of others, including those with whom he disagreed, and sought to understand them before responding. He knew Aristotle well, and he did not fear his thought. Instead, he sought to read it in the light of Christian faith, to see where it could serve understanding and where it needed correction. His mind moved with a wide embrace, welcoming what was true wherever it appeared. Thomas, sitting among the students, absorbed this approach. He recognized in Albert a pattern that resonated with his own slow, thorough way of thinking. Here was a teacher who did not dismiss philosophy as a danger, but welcomed it as a tool. Here was a master who showed that one could love God deeply while also examining the world with careful reasoning. The harmony that Thomas had sensed was possible between faith and reason took on a more concrete shape under Albert's guidance. There is a story, often told in gentle tones, about how others saw Thomas at this time. His classmates, noticing his silence and his large, somewhat awkward presence, called him the dumb ox. To them, his quiet nature and few words suggested a lack of brilliance. He did not sparkle in quick debates. He did not rush to the front of the room or seek to impress with clever phrases. He seemed slow, heavy, more like an ox than an agile bird. Albert, however, saw differently. According to the tradition, when he read a piece of Thomas's work or heard him explain his thoughts, he recognized the depth beneath the silence. "You call him a dumb ox," he is said to have remarked, "but his bellowing will yet sound throughout the world." The words, whether reported exactly or not, express a deeper reality, a great teacher recognizing a hidden greatness in his student, not in arrogance or flattery, but in calm, clear perception. Under Albert's guidance, Thomas learned not only facts and theories, but a way of proceeding in thought. He watched how Albert began with questions, not afraid to lay out objections in detail. He studied the structure of arguments, how to distinguish different senses of a word, how to move step by step from what is known or more certain to what is less known but still attainable. This method, orderly and patient, suited Thomas perfectly. It was like finding, after years of searching, a tool shaped exactly to fit his hand. Cologne, where Albert eventually took Thomas to continue his teaching, offered a different atmosphere from Paris. The air was cooler, the language around them more German than French or Italian, the river flowing broad and quiet past the city. In the Dominican community there, Thomas found a stable setting in which his thoughts could deepen further. The days were divided between prayer and choir, meals taken in common silence or simple conversation, and long hours of study. In the scriptorium, or the study halls, the sound of quills scratching on parchment accompanied the steady unfolding of ideas. Thomas's large figure might be seen bent over a desk, his hand moving slowly, his eyes focused on the lines before him. He copied texts, commented on them, and began to compose his own reflections. In these early writings, mirroring Albert's breadth, he showed interest not only in theological issues but also in philosophical questions, especially as framed by Aristotle and interpreted by Muslim and Jewish thinkers of earlier centuries. Yet even as he delved into complex ideas, his life remained rooted in prayer. The chapel was never far from the classroom. Bells called him and his brothers to chant the Psalms, to celebrate the liturgy, to stand together before the mystery of God that no human argument could ever fully contain. The balance between faith and reason, between contemplation and study, was not merely a theory for Thomas. It was the texture of his days. Sometimes, after a long session of study with Albert, one can imagine Thomas stepping outside for a few moments, breathing the cool air, watching the light fade along the river. The questions of the classroom, about essence and existence, about form and matter, about the nature of the soul, did not vanish when he left his desk, but they softened into a larger context. The world around him, with its steady flow of water, its changing skies, its human faces, became a kind of quiet commentary on all that he had read, a reminder that the truths he sought were not mere abstractions, but reflections of a living, creating God. Albert sometimes sent his students to examine particular questions or texts more closely, asking them to present their findings. When Thomas spoke, he did so without theatricality. His voice was measured, his words chosen with care. He did not display the quick wit that some prized in debate, but he offered something more enduring: clarity, coherence, and a humble willingness to follow an argument wherever it truthfully led. This period as a disciple of Albert the Great was like the slow, steady growth of a tree's roots. Much of what was happening in Thomas's mind and heart was hidden from view, but it prepared him for the expansive branches and abundant fruit that would later appear in his own teaching and writing. He learned how to engage differing views without fear, how to respect what truth they contained while gently correcting what was lacking or mistaken. He saw in his master a living example of intellectual charity, a willingness to understand others before responding to them. In the evenings, the Dominican convent would grow quiet. Lamps were lit along the corridors. The day's conversations faded into murmurs. In the dormitory or his cell, Thomas would lie on a simple bed, perhaps reviewing in his mind the questions they had discussed. Somewhere nearby, Albert might also be at work, preparing the next day's lectures, reading by lamplight. The bond between them was not one of sentimentality, but of shared pursuit. Two minds, one older and experienced, one younger and unfolding, both turned toward the same luminous mystery. The debates that swirled in the wider university and church about how to receive Aristotle, about the role of the mendicant orders, about the relation between philosophy and theology, were not merely external controversies for Thomas. They touched the very core of what he was learning from Albert. He saw that the way one approached knowledge mattered deeply, that fear and suspicion could close doors that gentle confidence might open. With Albert as his guide, he came to believe that truth, wherever it appeared, could not ultimately contradict the God who is truth itself. Years later, when Thomas would stand as a master of theology in his own right, questions arranged in careful order before him, arguments unfolding with serene precision, one could still hear, low and steady beneath his thought, the voice of Albert, the patient teacher who had shown him how to think with faith, how to let the mind work at full strength without leaving the heart behind. For now, though, he remained the disciple, a large, quiet friar in a black and white habit, walking through the streets of Paris and Cologne, listening more than speaking, learning from his master not only what to think, but how to think. Under Albert's watchful eye, the dumb ox was slowly finding his voice, a voice that would one day carry the calm music of reason and faith intertwined, like two notes in a single enduring harmony. When the time came for Thomas to step out from behind the desks of the student benches and take his place at the front of the classroom, the change was almost as quiet as his manner. There was no sudden transformation in his demeanor, no new sharpness in his tone. He did not become a different man for having been given the title of master. Instead, the same deep calm, the same steady attention that had marked him as a student, simply began to shine from another vantage point. The quill that had so long received the words of others now shaped words that others would receive. Paris called him back. The city he had once known as a student became, for a time, the center of his work as a teacher. The Seine flowed under its bridges as before, carrying reflections of sky and stone along its surface. The narrow streets filled with scholars and friars, their cloaks brushing against one another as they passed, their voices rising in conversation about theology, philosophy, law, and the affairs of the day. Above them, the towers of churches watched in silence, their bells marking the hours of prayer. In this setting, Thomas took up the role of magister, master of theology, at the University of Paris. He joined the ranks of those who lectured on scripture, preached to the faithful, and presided over disputations, where complex questions were laid out, argued, and clarified. For many, the new position would have been a reason to claim honor, to stand taller, to let the voice grow louder. But Thomas's way remained what it had always been: measured, steady, almost gentle in its firmness. The classroom in which he taught was plain. Wooden beams overhead, rough walls, perhaps a crucifix on one side, and a narrow window letting in a soft, shifting light. Students sat on benches or simple stools, their tablets or parchments ready. Some were eager and attentive, others tired, distracted, or drawn toward the more dramatic lectures offered elsewhere. When Thomas entered, his large figure in the black and white of the Dominican habit filled the doorway. He walked to his place calmly, without haste, and when he began to speak, his voice did not thunder. It flowed. His lessons on Scripture were, at heart, an act of listening. He listened to the text, to the long tradition of commentary that had grown up around it, and to the questions of his students. He did not treat the sacred pages as a puzzle to be solved once and for all, but as a living word in which layers of meaning could be patiently uncovered. He moved through the verses with care, pausing over a single phrase, considering how it had been understood by earlier fathers, and then gently offering his own clarifications. In theology, he followed a similar pattern. Questions were presented, often questions that others avoided out of fear. How can we speak of God if God is beyond our understanding? How can human freedom exist if God knows all things? How do faith and reason relate to one another? How can we reconcile the goodness of God with the existence of suffering in the world? Thomas did not dismiss these questions or rush to silence them. He welcomed them into the light, as one might invite troubled guests to sit and speak in a quiet room. The form of teaching known as the disputed question suited him perfectly. In these public sessions, he would pose a question, then lay out the objections with care, often phrased more strongly than his opponents themselves might have managed. Only after giving full space to the difficulties would he gently turn to the other side, bringing forward reasons in favor of the proposed answer. Finally, he would offer his own solution, not as a shout of victory, but as a calm weaving together of what was true in each position, setting aside what was mistaken, and placing all in a clear order. Those who came to hear him sometimes expected drama. Controversy was in the air. The mendicant friars, the Dominicans and Franciscans, had become the subject of heated disputes at the university. Some secular masters resented their growing influence, their way of living on alms, their close connection to the papacy. Accusations and defenses flew back and forth. In such an environment, words were often sharpened into weapons, and lectures became stages for rivalry. Thomas, however, did not turn his classroom into a battlefield. When he defended the rights of the mendicant orders to teach and preach, he did so with clarity, but without bitterness. His arguments rested on principles, not on attacks. He reminded his listeners that truth is not owned by any one group, and that the gifts of different vocations, secular clergy, monks, friars, could be held together within the larger harmony of the church. When he spoke, the noise of resentment seemed to fade, not because he forced it away, but because his words invited a quieter, more spacious way of seeing. Students who came with suspicions or with their minds already made up sometimes found those certainties softened by his presence. He did not demand agreement. He invited reflection. His intelligence was evident, but it did not press itself forward with pride. It appeared more as a clear light than as a burning flame, illuminating, not scorching. He treated objections with respect, as if each one carried a fragment of truth that deserved to be acknowledged before being corrected. Outside the formal lectures and disputations, Thomas's life remained simple. He lived with his Dominican brothers in community, keeping the same rhythm of prayer and common life as before. In the early mornings, before the city had fully awakened, he would walk to the chapel, the hem of his habit brushing softly against the stones. There, in the quiet of the choir, he joined his voice to the psalms, the ancient words rising and falling in patterns that had accompanied him since Monte Cassino. After prayer and a simple meal, he returned to his desk. Books gathered around him: Scripture, the Fathers of the Church, Aristotle, commentaries of Jewish and Muslim philosophers, and the writings of earlier theologians. His hand moved steadily over parchment, arranging thoughts that had matured during hours of reflection. The works he wrote during his periods in Paris, commentaries, disputations, and parts of his great syntheses, were often born from questions raised in the classroom or in private conversation with students. Sometimes, a young friar might hesitate at his door, uncertain whether to disturb him. Thomas's reputation as a great theologian could have been intimidating. Yet those who entered found not a distant or severe master, but a patient listener. He answered questions with the same calm he brought to public lectures, often starting not with his own opinion, but by helping the questioner express more clearly what they were really asking. He guided minds gently, teaching not only conclusions, but the way of reaching them. The streets of Paris, noisy with daily life, formed a background to these quieter labors. On days of harsh weather, rain pelted the roofs and turned the streets to mud. On clear evenings, the sky stretched above the city in deepening shades of blue and gray, stars emerging one by one. Thomas walked through these streets like a man passing through a hall of echoes, aware of the sounds and movements around him, but not absorbed by them. His steps were directed more by the inner landscape of his thoughts and prayer. The controversies over Aristotle continued, and Thomas found himself drawn into them, not by choice, but by necessity. Some insisted that the newly recovered philosophy from the ancient world had no place in Christian theology, that it would corrupt faith and lead souls astray. Others embraced it uncritically, seeking to mold Christian belief to fit its categories without discernment. Thomas stood between these extremes, not as a hesitant man caught in indecision, but as someone holding both realities in a larger vision. He showed in his lectures and writings how the tools of Aristotelian philosophy, its understanding of form and matter, act and potency, substance and accident, could be used to express the mysteries of faith more clearly. Yet he also showed where philosophy must stop, where reason alone could not reach, where revelation must be received as a gift. For him, there was no need for conflict between faith and reason, because both came from the same source, God. It was as if he were gently taking two hands that others had set against each other and guiding them toward a handshake. In the disputations on the Eucharist, on grace, on the nature of the soul, his teaching was marked not only by precision, but by reverence. The mysteries he spoke of were not merely topics on a syllabus. They were realities he encountered each day in prayer. His students sensed this. Even when they strained to follow the intricacies of his arguments, they felt that behind the words stood a man who did not separate thinking from worship or doctrine from devotion. Occasionally, tensions in the university flared into open conflict. Processions, public letters, petitions to higher authorities. Thomas participated where duty required, writing defenses of the mendicant orders, answering accusations, clarifying misunderstandings. Yet even in these moments, his tone remained strangely peaceful. He did not answer anger with anger, nor contempt with contempt. He answered with arguments, offered in language that was firm but never cruel. At night, when the lectures were over and the city grew quieter, Thomas's lamp might still be burning in a small cell. Parchment lay around him, some filled with careful lines of script, others blank, waiting. He would pause sometimes, the quill resting in his fingers, his gaze lifted from the page. In those pauses, the questions of the day, about rights and privileges, about theories and counter-theories, seemed to recede, and a simpler reality emerged. A man, a friar, a child of God, thinking and writing not for his own honor, but to help others see more clearly the one he adored. The students who filed out of his lectures, pulling their cloaks tighter around themselves in the chill, might not have fully realized what they had witnessed. To them, he was one master among several, and the days of their studies were full of many voices. But some carried away from his classroom not only notes and arguments, but a certain stillness, the memory of a large, quiet friar whose mind moved with luminous order, and whose words, even when dealing with the most intricate questions, seemed to settle the heart rather than agitate it. Thus, in Paris, Thomas Aquinas became a calm voice in the midst of university debates, a voice that did not shout to be heard, but which, precisely because it did not shout, drew those who were tired of noise. His years as a master there did not lift him out of the ordinary rhythms of Dominican life. They simply gave him a new place from which to live them, a higher step from which his steady, thoughtful gaze could help others find a path through the many questions that crowded their minds. And slowly, without fanfare, the work of those years began to shape not only the minds of his students, but the larger current of thought in the church. Like a river deepening its course as it passes quietly through a landscape, the teaching of Thomas in Paris carved out a gentle but lasting channel through which many later hearts and minds would pass, finding, in his ordered clarity, a reflection of the peace he had always sought in the God he served. There are books that are born in the noise of argument, shaped by the sharp edges of urgency and controversy. And there are books that seem to be born in a quieter place, as if they had taken form in the stillness of a heart that has learned to trust both God and the patient work of reason. Among the many works associated with the name of Thomas Aquinas, the Summa Contra Gentiles belongs especially to this second kind. By the time he began to compose it, Thomas was no longer the uncertain youth making his first choices, nor the young friar still finding his place among the great teachers of his time. He was a Dominican preacher and theologian whose mind had been carefully trained, whose vocation had been tested, whose life of study and prayer had settled into a deep and steady rhythm. The years of listening in classrooms, of walking in cloisters, of kneeling in chapels had given him something that cannot be rushed, a certain inner clarity, a sense of how truth unfolds when one is not trying to force it. The world around him, however, was anything but calm. Christianity lived side by side, and sometimes across sharp lines, with other faiths and other philosophies. In the lands of Spain, for example, Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived in complex patterns of coexistence and tension. Philosophical works from the Islamic world, written by thinkers like Avicenna and Averroes, circulated among scholars, bringing with them subtle interpretations of Aristotle and new ways of framing questions about God, the soul, and the universe. Jewish philosophers such as Maimonides offered their own carefully reasoned reflections. The distances between these different views of the world were not only matters of belief, they were also matters of language, culture, and history. Within the Dominican order, there was a desire to speak about the Christian faith in a way that could be heard beyond the boundaries of Christendom, especially in places where missionaries and preachers met people shaped by other religious traditions. The task was not merely to defend, but to explain, to unfold the reasons one might have for believing in God, in divine providence, in the immortality of the soul, and in time, in the mysteries specifically revealed in Christ. For such a task, they needed someone whose mind could hold together many strands of thought without becoming tangled, someone who could move patiently from the most basic questions to the higher truths of faith. In this context, Thomas began the work that would be called Summa Contra Gentiles, a summary against the pagans, though the word against can be misleading if taken in a harsh sense. His approach was not that of a warrior sharpening weapons, but of a teacher setting out to build a bridge of understanding using the tools of reason that all human beings, whatever their background, possess. One can imagine him in a quiet room, a lamp burning softly to his side, parchment spread before him. Outside, the life of the friary continued. Brothers moving along the corridors, the distant murmur of their voices, the sound of a bell calling them to prayer. The world beyond the friary walls was full of turmoil and complexity, but within his cell, Thomas shaped sentences that moved step by gentle step from what any thoughtful person might notice about the world, its order, its causes, its patterns, toward the one who is the source of all that is. The structure of the Summa Contra Gentiles reflects this calm movement. It does not begin with sharp slogans or accusations, but with a reflection on the task itself, how and why we speak of God, and what reason can and cannot achieve. Thomas distinguishes, with his characteristic clarity, between truths about God that the human mind can reach by its own power, such as God's existence and some aspects of the divine nature, and truths that surpass reason and can only be known by revelation, such as the mystery of the Trinity or the Incarnation. This distinction becomes the guiding thread for the work. In the early books, he walks carefully along the path of reason alone. He does not expect that those who do not accept Christian revelation will acknowledge the authority of Scripture or the Church, and so he does not lean on them in these sections. Instead, he looks to the shared experience of the world, to the ways in which things move and change, to the fact that nothing in the universe causes itself, to the gradations of goodness, truth, and beauty that we see. From these starting points, he slowly leads the reader toward the conclusion that there must be a first cause, a pure act of being, a highest good that is not just one thing among others, but the source of all. The reasoning unfolds without haste. Thomas anticipates objections, not with irritation, but with respect. He knows that others have thought differently about these matters, and he shows that he has listened to them. He calmly sets out their positions, then offers reasons for a different understanding. It is as if he were sitting in a quiet room with someone who does not share his faith, saying, "Let us begin where we agree, and see how far our shared reason can take us." Only later in the Summa contra Gentiles does he turn more fully to those truths that exceed human reasoning as such. There, he does not pretend that these mysteries can be proved in the same way as the existence of God. Instead, he explains how they are not contrary to reason, even if they cannot be reached by it without revelation. Faith, for Thomas, is not an abandonment of reason, but a step beyond it, like climbing higher on a mountain after walking as far as the clear path goes. The atmosphere in which he wrote this work was not one of abstract detachment. Though his style was sober and ordered, he knew that behind the questions of philosophy and theology lay real human lives, men and women trying to make sense of their existence, their hopes, their fears, their longing for meaning. When he wrote about the human soul, about its immaterial nature, about its destiny beyond death, he was not merely solving intellectual puzzles. He was offering a way for minds to find confidence that our deepest desires are not illusions, that there is a goodness beyond us that calls us lovingly toward itself. At times, one can sense in his writing a kind of quiet compassion for those who struggle to believe, or who stand outside the faith looking in. He does not mock them, nor dismiss their questions. Instead, he takes their doubts seriously, as if to say, "Your questions are worth answering. Your reasoning powers are a gift, and they can bring you closer to the truth. Even if there remain heights you cannot climb without grace." The Summa contra Gentiles is also marked by a serene trust in the unity of truth. Thomas does not fear that what is genuinely known by philosophers, even those who do not share his faith, will ultimately contradict what God has revealed. If there is a tension, he believes it arises from human limits, misunderstandings, incomplete views, or mistakes, not from any real opposition within the truth itself. This trust allows him to quote thinkers from outside the Christian tradition without anxiety, drawing from their insights as a craftsman selects useful tools, grateful for the good he finds in them. In the practical life of the order, the work would have been a resource for preachers and missionaries, especially in regions where they encountered people shaped by other religious traditions. It gave them a way to speak not only about what Christians believe, but why one might find it reasonable to do so, meeting their listeners on the common ground of shared human experience. It invited dialogue rather than shouting, explanation rather than denunciation. We can picture in some distant town or quiet mission house a Dominican friar with a copy of Thomas's work beside him, preparing to speak with someone who does not share his faith. He reads the carefully ordered arguments, not as rigid formulas, but as paths that minds might walk together. In this way, the calm that Thomas had brought to the noisy halls of Paris extended itself outward across distances, offering a gentle way of speaking about God in a world of many voices. For Thomas himself, the Summa contra Gentiles was another way of living his vocation as a preacher and teacher. He preached not only with words spoken in church pulpits, but with words written in ink, sentences that would travel further than his voice ever could. He did so without illusion. He knew that not everyone would be persuaded, that many would remain unconvinced or uninterested. Yet he also knew that even a single mind helped along the path toward truth is worth all the effort, and that the work of explaining and clarifying can be an act of charity. The image of him, large and still at his desk, writing this work while the day outside passes from morning to evening, can stay with us. His quill scratches lightly across the parchment. Occasionally he pauses, perhaps lifting his eyes to a crucifix on the wall, or to a small window where the sky can be seen in a narrow strip of blue. The questions he considers are vast, but he approaches them without agitation. God, the world, the soul, truth and error, belief and doubt, all are brought gently into an ordered whole in his mind, and then onto the page. In a time when many conversations about religion and philosophy were marked by heat and suspicion, the Summa contra Gentiles offered something else, a model of how one might speak of God to seekers and questioners with a calm confidence that does not scorn their doubts, a confidence rooted not in force or fear, but in the conviction that the one who is truth guides every sincere search. And in the quiet of his cell, Thomas Aquinas continued that search alongside his readers, walking with them as far as reason could go, and then standing with them at the edge where faith begins, looking out toward a mystery that, though beyond words, had already captured his heart. There are some works that seem to grow like a tree, ring by ring, year by year, each new layer resting quietly on what has come before. The Summa Theologiae of Thomas Aquinas is such a work. It did not arrive all at once, in a burst of inspiration, but unfolded slowly as he moved from place to place, teaching and preaching, praying and pondering. It is vast, but its vastness is not chaotic. It is ordered, like a well-tended garden, where every path leads somewhere, and every plant has been given its place. By the time Thomas began the Summa Theologiae, he was already an experienced master of theology. He had taught in Paris, worked in Italy, written commentaries on Scripture and on Aristotle, and composed his earlier synthesis in the Summa contra Gentiles. His reputation as a thinker had grown, though he himself remained as personally modest as ever. The order trusted him with important tasks, calling on him again and again to teach, to advise, and to help form younger friars. It was for these younger friars, above all, that he envisioned the Summa Theologiae. The Dominican order continued to send its members into universities and cities where they needed a solid formation in theology, not only for their own understanding, but so that they could preach and teach clearly to others. Thick, scattered volumes existed, of course. The writings of the fathers, the earlier scholastics, the canon lawyers. These offered a rich but sometimes overwhelming landscape. Thomas wanted to provide something more direct, more accessible, without being shallow. A clear, ordered guide through the main questions of Christian teaching. He did not set out to write a book that would be famous centuries later. He set out to help his brothers. And perhaps that is part of why the Summa has such a calm, almost homely clarity about it, even when it treats the most elevated mysteries. Its tone is not that of a man addressing distant posterity. It is the voice of a teacher speaking to students he can imagine sitting in front of him, their faces familiar, their questions known. The structure of the Summa reflects Thomas's love of order. He divides it into three great parts, like three movements of a long, quiet composition. The first part deals with God in himself and with the act of creation, who God is, how we speak about God, how creatures come from God and depend on him. The second part, really two sections, called the first part of the second part and the second part of the second part, deals with the human journey toward God, the moral life, virtues and vices, habits, laws, grace, and the specific virtues and gifts that shape a holy life. The third part turns to Christ and the sacraments, the mystery of the Incarnation, the life, passion, and resurrection of Jesus, and the sacramental life through which grace touches souls. Within each part, the same pattern repeats itself with gentle precision. Questions are posed. Each question is divided into articles, and each article follows the same quiet rhythm. Objections first, then a brief quotation from Scripture or an authority, on the contrary, followed by Thomas's own response, I answer that, and finally replies to each of the objections. It is as if every article were a small room with four walls, First, the voices of those who disagree or raise difficulties. Then, a stronger voice from tradition. Then the calm explanation of the master. And finally, the gentle turning back to each objection, addressing it one by one. The objections are not straw men. Thomas knows how people actually think and where their difficulties lie. He states these difficulties fairly, sometimes more clearly than his opponents themselves. In doing so, he shows respect for those who struggle, and he also shows confidence. Confidence that the truth, once seen, will not be harmed by a full airing of questions. When he turns, in the "I answer that," to his own explanation, there is no rush. Each sentence builds on the last. He moves from simpler points to more complex ones, from what is better known to what is less known. He uses distinctions not as weapons to split hairs, but as tools to avoid confusion. Words like being, goodness, cause, nature, and will are carefully defined and placed. Reading him is like following the steady steps of a walker who knows the path well and does not stumble. In the first part, his gaze is turned upward, toward God and the origin of all things. He knows that the human mind cannot comprehend God fully, and he says so plainly. Yet he also believes that, with the aid of revelation and the tools of reason, we can say something true about God, even if we cannot say everything. He speaks of God's existence, of God as pure act of being, of divine simplicity, goodness, knowledge, and will. He unfolds the doctrine of the Trinity with care, moving slowly, distinguishing what can be known by reason alone from what depends solely on revelation. He then turns to creation, to angels, to the material world, and finally to the human person, a creature with both body and soul, made in the image of God. In the second part, the tone almost shifts, not in style, but in focus. Now the question is, given that we come from God, how do we return to God? What does it mean to live well, to act well, to love rightly? Thomas approaches moral life not as a set of prohibitions, but as a journey toward happiness, true happiness, not passing pleasure. He speaks of the end of human life, the beatific vision, and then of the virtues, those stable habits that shape our actions: prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, and the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. He treats the interior structure of the human person with a kind of quiet respect, exploring how intellect and will, passions and reason, can be brought into harmonious cooperation rather than conflict. He does not ignore sin or weakness. He analyzes vices and failures with the same clarity as he gives to virtues, but without harshness. His pages on grace, on how God's help elevates and heals human nature, show a delicate balance. He neither crushes human effort under the weight of divine power, nor exalts human effort as if it could reach heaven unaided. Instead, he quietly holds both truths, that we are truly acting when we do good, and that God is gently working in us as the first cause of that good. In the second part of the second part, he turns to particular virtues and states of life: charity, humility, courage, religious life, and more. Here, the work often feels very close to actual pastoral concerns. He is no longer only dealing with high abstractions, but with concrete questions about how one ought to live, how to speak, how to give, how to pray, how to judge, how to relate to others. Even in these more detailed sections, his tone remains serene. He does not thunder condemnations. He traces lines, shows proportions, weighs motives. He seems to trust that those who read him will recognize themselves gently in his descriptions and be nudged toward a clearer path. The third part, which he did not live to complete, lifts the gaze to Christ. For Thomas, everything he has said about God, creation, and the human journey finds its center and fulfillment in the incarnate Word. When he writes about the humanity and divinity of Christ, about the union of the two natures in one person, his language remains precise, but there is a warmth beneath the precision. He contemplates the life of Jesus, the mysteries of his birth, teaching, passion, and resurrection, not as isolated events, but as steps in a single act of saving love. He then turns to the sacraments, especially the Eucharist, which held a special place in his heart. His treatment of them is at once logical and reverent. He explains why there are 7, how each one works, what grace each brings. He uses philosophical distinctions to clarify how Christ is present in the Eucharist. Yet behind those distinctions one senses the quiet adoration of a friar who spent long hours in prayer before the tabernacle, composing hymns that would be sung for centuries. The writing of the Summa Theologiae accompanied Thomas through different assignments and travels. Parts of it were written in Italy, parts during his second period in Paris, parts in other cities where the order sent him. His life was busy, teaching, advising, answering letters, participating in missions of diplomacy for the Church. And yet, amid all this movement, the Summa advanced, question by question, article by article, like a steady stream flowing through changing landscapes. Those who saw him at work describe a man who dictated to several secretaries at once, moving from one topic to another, without losing the thread of any. To imagine this properly, one must set aside the idea of frantic multitasking, and instead picture a mind so ordered that different lines of thought could be carried side by side like parallel paths, each clear, each distinct, each resumed without strain. Behind this ability lay years of disciplined attention, of training in memory and reasoning, and above all, a habit of prayer that constantly oriented his thinking toward God. In the refectory, where the friars took their meals, Thomas's appetite was said to be hearty, fitting his large frame. Yet he remained oblivious to honors and praise. Stories tell of him falling into deep thought even at table, his mind suddenly seized by some insight. On one occasion, according to tradition, he struck the table and exclaimed, forgetting where he was, "That will settle the Manichees!" A sudden spark of intellectual joy breaking through his usual quiet. The brothers smiled. They were accustomed to these moments when his interior world surfaced briefly in an outward gesture. The Summa Theologiae was never fully finished. Thomas worked diligently, but the third part, especially its treatment of the sacraments and the last things, remains incomplete. This incompleteness gives the work a slightly open edge, like a long, beautiful sentence that trails off just before its final period. Yet even in its unfinished state, the Summa breathes a sense of wholeness. It offers a view of reality in which God, world, and soul are held together in an ordered embrace, without violent opposition. For those who came after, the work became a reference point, a map of sorts. Theologians and students, preachers and contemplatives, turned to its pages to find both answers and a way of asking questions. Not all agreed with every detail. Not all followed his approach in the same way. But many found in his calm, methodical writing a kind of sanctuary from the confusion of their own times, a place where thought could move without haste, and faith could breathe without fear. In the long arc of Thomas's life, the Summa Theologiae stands as the quiet culmination of his years of study, teaching, and prayer. It is not the only measure of his holiness or his wisdom, but it is a faithful reflection of the order and clarity that had gradually formed within him. The child who once asked, "What is God?" had grown into a man who spent his days tracing answers in orderly lines, knowing that no book could fully contain the one he loved, yet offering, to those who would come after him, a path of thought that might lead them gently closer to that mystery. Behind the heavy pages and intricate arguments of Thomas's writings, there was always another, quieter room in his life, a place where ink and parchment were set aside, and where words, though still present, were sung or whispered rather than written. To understand him only as a thinker is to see only half his face. The other half is turned toward the altar, toward the small, consecrated host that, according to his faith, was not merely a symbol, but Christ himself. The rhythm of his days as a Dominican was marked by the liturgy of the hours. Morning, midday, evening, and night, the bells called the brothers to choir. The community gathered, black and white habits lined in rows, psalms unfolding along the stone walls. Thomas was one voice among many. chanting ancient words that had comforted and challenged believers across centuries. Those who were close to him noticed something in the way he prayed, a quiet intensity, a deep absorption that did not draw attention to itself, but that made it seem as if, in those moments, he belonged wholly to the one whose name he invoked. In the early light, before the city fully awakened, he would stand in the choir stalls, his large frame still, his eyes fixed on the book or on a point just beyond it. The Psalms spoke of longing for God, of trust, of sorrow and joy, of history and hope. They were not mere texts to him. They were the living voice of the church, speaking to God with the words God had first placed on human lips. His mind, trained to analyze and distinguish, did not disappear during prayer, but it rested, like a tool laid gently aside at the end of a day's work. Here, the heart took the lead, even as the understanding remained quietly awake. After the communal prayers were finished, and after the duties of teaching and study had taken their share of his strength, Thomas often returned to the chapel alone. According to the testimony of those who knew him, he would spend long stretches of time there, kneeling before the tabernacle. The flickering of a sanctuary lamp, the faint scent of incense left in the air from earlier liturgies, the steady presence of the altar, all of these formed the setting for his personal conversation with God. Sometimes he prayed in words, lifting up petitions for his brothers, his students, the church, the world. Sometimes he simply remained in silence, as if letting himself be seen rather than insisting on being heard. There is a sense, in the stories that reach us, that these hours in the chapel were not separate from his theological work, but their source. The questions he addressed in his writings, the nature of God, the meaning of grace, the mystery of Christ's presence in the Eucharist, were not just intellectual puzzles. They were realities he had first reverently faced on his knees. His devotion to the Eucharist, in particular, left a trace that has lingered long after the details of many debates have faded. When a new liturgical feast was extended to the wider church, the Feast of Corpus Christi, celebrating Christ's presence in the Blessed Sacrament, Thomas was asked to compose its prayers and hymns. Out of the quiet of his heart emerged words that would be sung for centuries, melodies and lines that carried dense theology in simple, luminous language. According to tradition, he wrote hymns such as Pange Lingua, Tantum Ergo, Verbum Supernum, and Adoro Te Devote. These texts do not read like abstract treatises. They are meditations, almost gentle confessions of faith. In them, the keen distinctions of his classroom give way to a more intimate tone. He speaks of seeing bread and wine with the eyes of the body, but acknowledging with the eyes of faith a deeper reality. He addresses Christ directly, not as a topic, but as a beloved presence hidden and revealed under humble signs. One can picture him, perhaps late at night, seated in a quiet corner of a convent, composing these lines by lamplight. The world outside is dim and largely asleep. His brothers have gone to their cells. The day's lectures are finished, the questions of his students temporarily at rest. In that stillness, he turns his attention to the one for whom he ultimately worked and wrote. His hand moves steadily, but the tone of his words suggests less a scholar explaining and more a lover contemplating. Even the structure of his Eucharistic hymns reflects the same ordered mind that crafted the Summa, yet the mood is softer. He weaves together scripture, theology, and personal devotion, but the result is not heavy. It is light, almost transparent, like a stained glass window in which complex patterns let the sun through in gentle colors. Those who sang these hymns at processions or during adoration might not have known the full depth of the ideas behind them, but they felt the reverence, the trust, the wonder. His prayer did not always move along smooth lines. Like every soul, he knew moments of dryness, of distraction, of fatigue. There were nights when his body ached from study and travel, when his mind was full of unresolved questions or practical concerns. Yet even then, he came back to the chapel, letting his tiredness itself become a kind of offering. The God he adored in the Eucharist was not, for him, far away and inaccessible. He was near, hidden under the quiet form of bread, waiting with a patience even greater than Thomas's own. There are small stories told by his contemporaries that give us glimpses of this hidden life of prayer. It is said, for example, that when he struggled with a particularly difficult question in theology, he did not simply remain at his desk, wrestling alone with concepts. He would go to the chapel, lay his head for a moment against the tabernacle, or stand there in silence, asking not for a clever answer, but for light that was both true and humble. The solutions that later appeared in his writings often carry the mark of this disposition. They clarify, but they do not boast. They seek to serve the truth, not to use it as a pedestal. For Thomas, the Eucharist was both the summit of the Christian life and the quiet center of his own vocation. In the classroom, he could analyze how Christ is present under the species of bread and wine, distinguishing substance and accidents, explaining transubstantiation with patient care. In the chapel, those distinctions gave way to adoration. Kneeling before the sacrament, he did not repeat definitions. He simply worshipped. The same mind that could write about God's simplicity and infinity accepted with childlike trust that this God had chosen to be so close, so hidden, so small. Sometimes, after a day filled with teaching and writing, he might remain alone in the dim church while the last light faded from the windows. The wooden benches, the stone floor, the statues watching from their niches, all seemed to settle into a deeper silence. The only movement was the small flame of the candle near the tabernacle. Its light reflected faintly in the polished metal of the monstrance or ciborium. In that atmosphere, his prayer might have been nothing more complicated than resting in God's presence, letting his whole being become a listening. His brothers noticed that, when he came away from these times of prayer, he was not agitated or overly intense. He was simply more himself, calm, focused, gentle. The questions that awaited him on his desk, the requests for advice, the needs of the order and the church, all could weigh heavily. Yet the weight did not crush him, because he had learned where to lay it down, even if only for a while, in front of the one he trusted. It is also according to tradition that, near the end of his life, he was granted a particularly powerful spiritual experience while praying before the crucifix or the Eucharist. The stories differ in detail, but they agree on this. After that encounter, he found it difficult to continue his writing. He had been working on the Summa Theologiae, weaving arguments and distinctions with his usual clarity, when this light touched him in prayer. When his secretary urged him to go on, he is reported to have said that he could not, for everything he had written seemed like straw compared with what had been shown to him. These words have been repeated many times, sometimes misunderstood as if Thomas were dismissing his own work as worthless. But taken in their proper sense, they reflect something deeply consistent with his life of prayer. He never believed that theology could contain God. His writings were always meant as paths, not as prisons. In that final experience, the distance between God and all human words became, for him, more vivid than ever. And yet even then, he did not reject what he had done. He simply saw it under a softer light, as a real but limited offering, like the 5 loaves and 2 fish in the Gospel, small in itself, but entrusted into larger hands. His devotion to the Eucharist continued to the end. When illness came, when his body weakened and his journeys grew shorter, he still turned towards the sacrament that had been the heart of his prayer. When the time approached for him to leave this world, he asked to receive Holy Communion with special reverence. Those who stood near him heard the tenderness in his voice, the clear faith with which he spoke of Christ's presence. The theologian, who had written so carefully about the sacrament, now approached it as a pilgrim at the threshold, receiving nourishment for the last part of the journey. In the centuries that followed, many would read his works and admire his intelligence, his precision, his vast knowledge. But those who look more closely also detect beneath the lines of his texts the outline of a man who spent long hours in quiet chapels, who composed hymns not to impress, but to adore, who let his mind be led by faith into places where reasoning could only bow and fall silent. The pages of his books may seem dry to some at first glance, but if one listens carefully, there is a low, steady music running through them. The same music that once rose from his lips in chant, that accompanied the soft glow of candlelight on marble and wood, that held him in a humble awe before the small host that, for him, contained the one toward whom his whole life had been moving. In that hidden life of prayer, especially before the Eucharist, the scattered elements of his vocation came together. The child's question, "What is God?" The young student's search for understanding, the teacher's careful explanations. All of these were gathered up and offered day after day, at an altar where mysteries were celebrated in words and gestures older and deeper than any human system. There, in the quiet company of the sacrament, Thomas Aquinas lived not as a great theologian, but simply as a man kneeling before his Lord, letting himself be known and loved by the one he had spent his life seeking to understand. There are moments near the end of a life when time seems to change its pace, when days that once hurried past begin to move more slowly, as if they themselves were reluctant to cross a final threshold. For Thomas Aquinas, whose years had been filled with reading and writing, with teaching and travel, with prayer woven quietly through it all, the last chapter of his earthly journey unfolded in a way that was at once very human and deeply marked by mystery. By the early 1270s, the weight of his labors had begun to press upon his body. He had written and dictated thousands of pages, answered countless questions, taken part in the teaching life of the greatest university of his time, and served the order and the wider church in ways that often required long journeys over rough roads. His large frame, which had once carried him steadily from city to city, now tired more easily. Friends and brothers noticed that he moved a little more slowly, that pauses of rest came more often between his tasks. He was still at work on the Summa Theologiae, that vast ordered synthesis of Christian teaching he had undertaken for the sake of his younger brothers. The quills still scratched, the secretaries still took down his dictation, the questions still came in their careful sequence. The work was moving through its treatment of Christ and the sacraments, drawing closer to the mysteries that stood at the heart of his devotion. Yet, though his mind remained clear, there was a sense that he was nearing not only the end of a book, but the outer border of his earthly pilgrimage. At this time, Thomas was living in Italy, serving his order and the church in various capacities. He had been in Naples again, teaching and advising, when a call came that would shape his final months. The Pope had summoned him to take part in the Council of Lyon, a great assembly of bishops and theologians planned to address pressing issues in the life of the Church, including the hope of reconciliation with the Eastern Christians. Thomas's presence was desired for his wisdom, his clarity, his ability to bring harmony where confusion threatened. Obedient as always, he prepared to travel north. The road from southern Italy to Lyon was long, passing through cities and countryside, over hills and along river valleys. Winter and early spring can make such journeys harsh. Cold rain, muddy paths, winds sweeping across open fields. Thomas set out nonetheless, accompanied by a few brothers, trusting that the God who had guided his steps so far would guide them still. It was during this period, in the months before his departure or along the way, that something happened to him in prayer, something that those who loved him would never forget. According to tradition, while celebrating Mass or praying before the crucifix or the Eucharist, he was granted a powerful vision, a sudden, overwhelming glimpse of the divine reality he had spent his life contemplating with the tools of reason and faith. The accounts differ in detail, but they converge on this point. What he saw and experienced in that moment shook him to the core. No one can say exactly what unfolded in the hidden depths of his soul. He left no detailed description, no precise theological analysis of this experience. Perhaps that is fitting. Some encounters are too intimate, too far beyond the reach of ordinary language, to be captured in sentences. What we do know is what followed. After this vision, when his faithful secretary urged him to continue the Summa, Thomas hesitated. The work lay before him incomplete. The questions and articles awaited his dictation. But he did not pick up where he had left off. Instead, he spoke words that have echoed through the centuries. He said that he could write no more, for all that he had written seemed to him like straw compared to what had been shown to him. This simple comparison, pages of careful theology, weighed against a moment of direct encounter with God, does not mean that he came to despise his own work. Straw, after all, is not worthless. It has its place. It feeds animals. It cushions. It covers. But straw is light, fragile, unable to bear heavy weight. In that light, his words can be heard more as a confession of proportion than as a dismissal. For years, he had labored to say true things about God, to arrange doctrines in a clear order, to help minds move toward understanding. Now, in a single experience that touched him beyond thought, he had seen, or tasted, or felt in the depths of his being, something of the living God in a way that dwarfed even his most careful arguments. The books were not wrong. They were simply small, like lanterns beside the sun. After this event, his behavior changed. He became more withdrawn, more quiet than before. The brothers around him noticed that he no longer seemed eager to return to his writing desk. The manuscripts of the Summa remained open, but his dictation ceased. He still prayed, still celebrated Mass when he was able, still fulfilled the duties that remained to him. But a certain interior shift had occurred, as if his soul had turned its gaze more steadily toward a horizon beyond the reach of pen and paper. The Pope's summons still stood, and Thomas, faithful to his responsibilities, did not refuse it. He set out on the journey toward Lyon, even though his health was already fragile. The road carried him northward, away from the familiar light and air of southern Italy. Days of travel followed one another in quiet succession. Mornings of departure, afternoons of steady movement, evenings of rest in simple lodgings. Along the way, he may have passed fields lying pale under winter skies, villages where smoke rose in thin threads from cottage chimneys, streams running clear and cold over stones. As he traveled, his strength continued to ebb. Somewhere along the route, he became too weak to go on. Recognizing this, and not wanting to burden his companions or risk dying alone in a roadside lodging, he turned aside to a place that had long been a refuge for weary travelers. A Cistercian abbey, the monastery of Fossanova. The monks there, following the rule of Saint Benedict, lived a life of prayer, work, and silence, much like the one that had first formed Thomas as a child at Monte Cassino. When he arrived at Fossanova, the brothers received him with the hospitality their rule demanded, as Christ himself, tired and in need. They gave him a room, simple and bare, with perhaps a small bed, a table, a cross on the wall. The stone around him was cool, the air still. Outside, the rhythm of monastic life continued as usual. Bells called the monks to choir, psalms were chanted in Latin, the fields were tended, the cloister walked. Inside, Thomas's world narrowed to a few essential things: the presence of God, the company of his brothers, his own weakening body. The friars who accompanied him stayed by his side. They helped the monks care for him, shared news, and no doubt prayed for him and with him. In that quiet abbey, far from the bustling classrooms of Paris and the busy streets of Naples, the great theologian returned to something very simple: to being a sick man, carried now more by the prayers of others than by his own strength, preparing, though he may not have known the exact hour, for his final passage. The Cistercian monks, used to the slow approach of death in their own aged brothers, knew how to surround a dying man with reverence and calm. They called the community to pray. They listened if he wished to speak, or kept silence if he preferred to remain quiet. According to accounts that have come down to us, Thomas used the time to confess his faith with humility. He spoke of Christ present in the Eucharist with deep reverence. He received the sacraments of the Church with a tenderness that surprised even those who had long known his devotion. One can imagine him lying in his narrow bed, the covers pulled up to his chest, his breathing slowed. The light in the room would change through the day, thin in the morning, warmer by afternoon, dim and soft by evening. Footsteps moved quietly in the corridor outside, monks passing on their way to the next office of prayer. Occasionally, a brother would enter to check on him, a familiar Dominican face leaning over him with concern, or a Cistercian monk carrying a small candle and a book of prayers. If the vision he had experienced earlier remained vivid to him, he did not speak of it in detail. It had been a gift for his interior life, not a spectacle for others. What he did speak of, with moving simplicity, was his trust in God's mercy. The man who had written lines of luminous precision about grace now entrusted himself wholly to that grace, not as a concept, but as a living reality. He saw himself not as a great theologian presenting his works for inspection, but as a poor servant returning to a generous master. In those last days, the tension between his earlier work and his later silence found a kind of gentle resolution. The straw he had spoken of, the pages and pages of theological writing, did not simply vanish. They lay behind him as part of the path he had walked. But now, at the edge where words grow thin, he stood not as their defender, but as someone who had tried in his limited way to point beyond them. The questions that had once filled his hours of dictation now gave way to a simple, stable gaze upon the one to whom all questions ultimately lead. When the end came, it came not with great drama, but with the same quietness that had marked so much of his life. Surrounded by brothers in religion, held within the steady prayer of the monastery, he surrendered his spirit in 1274, still on the road, in a sense, to the council he would never reach. The great assembly in Lyon would go on without him. Others would speak, debate, decide. His contribution now would no longer be his physical presence or his spoken arguments, but the legacy of his thought and, more deeply still, the hidden power of a life poured out in fidelity. After his death, the monks and friars who had been with him remembered small details. They recalled his humility, his gratitude for their care, the way he received the Eucharist with tears, the peace that seemed to rest upon his features as his breath grew shallow. They carried those memories back to their communities, along with the books and notes he left behind. Slowly, news of his passing spread. The quiet friar, the dumb ox, whose voice had indeed resounded through the schools of Europe, had died far from the grand lecture halls, in a simple monastic room. In the years and centuries that followed, others would gather up his writings, edit them, comment on them, build new theological structures on the foundation he had laid. He would be honored with titles, studied by generations of students, cited in councils and encyclicals. His feast would be celebrated in many lands. Yet beneath all these later honors, the memory of his final vision and his subsequent silence remained, like a soft light touching the edges of his reputation. For those who ponder his life, that moment near the end, when he set down his pen and called his own work straw, serves as a gentle reminder. Even the greatest human efforts to speak of God are small in comparison with God's reality. Theology can be a noble service, an act of love and reason offered to the church and the world. But it is not an end in itself. It is a path, a signpost, a series of carefully drawn maps that must eventually yield to the direct experience of the country they describe. Thomas Aquinas, who had spent his days drawing such maps with extraordinary clarity, was allowed, according to tradition, a brief and intense glimpse of that country before he died. The experience did not make him despise the maps, it simply helped him see them in their true place. And so, at Fossanova, in the quiet company of monks and friars, under the soft light of an Italian sky, he crossed from the land of questions and partial answers into the mystery toward which he had always been moving. A mystery he had loved first as a child, asking, "What is God?" and finally as a lifelong seeker who had come to rest, not in his own writings, but in the living God whose face he had longed to see. In the years and centuries after Thomas Aquinas left this world from a quiet monastic room, the sound of his footsteps faded from the cloisters where he had once walked. The candles that had burned beside his bed at Fossanova melted down to stubs and were replaced. The monks who had prayed for him, one by one, went to their own rest, and the daily life of friaries and universities went on. Yet something of him remained, woven into the life of the church and the broader world of thought, like a calm, steady thread that does not draw attention to itself, but quietly holds many pieces together. At first, his presence lingered above all in the memories of those who had known him personally. Dominican brothers remembered the large, quiet friar who had eaten at their tables, prayed in their choirs, and taught in their schools. They told stories of his patience, his humility, his focus. They recalled the way he would fall into deep thought at unexpected moments, the way his voice sounded when he explained some complex question with such clarity that confusion seemed to melt away. For them, Thomas was not yet a towering figure of history. He was Brother Thomas, a man whose gentleness and fidelity spoke as loudly as his learning. His writings, however, had already begun to travel beyond the places he had physically known. The manuscripts of his works, painstakingly copied by hand in scriptoria and convents, moved along roads and rivers, carried by friars, scholars, and messengers. Pages of the Summa Theologiae, of his commentaries on Scripture and Aristotle, of his Summa contra Gentiles, passed into the hands of teachers in other schools, who read them slowly, sometimes with astonishment, at the order and breadth they found there. A young student in a distant university might sit before a wooden desk, an oil lamp flickering beside him, and open a volume bearing Thomas's name. He would trace the questions and articles with his finger, his eyes following the familiar pattern. Objections. On the contrary. I answer that. Replies. Perhaps he had struggled with these questions himself, about God's existence, about the nature of the soul, about virtue and vice, about grace. Now, in the calm lines of this Dominican's writing, he found not only answers, but a way of approaching truth that felt spacious and strangely peaceful. Thomas's influence spread slowly, like light moving across a landscape at dawn. It did not conquer by force. It invited, persuaded, and rested on its own inner coherence. Some resisted his approach, preferring older patterns of thought, or fearing the use he made of Aristotle and other philosophers. But many found in his work a clarity they had long desired, a sense that faith and reason need not stand across a gap glaring at one another, but could walk side by side, each respecting the other's role. In the centuries that followed, the Church would face new questions, new challenges, new controversies. Political changes, cultural shifts, new scientific discoveries, and deep wounds in Christian unity would all leave their mark. Amid these changing conditions, the writings of Thomas remained like a quiet harbor to which many returned when the seas grew rough. Councils cited his arguments, theologians built on his distinctions, teachers used his articles as starting points for further reflection. This growth of his reputation did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, as different generations discovered in him what they most needed. Some were drawn to his metaphysics, his serene account of being and causality, his affirmation that everything that exists is held in being by God, not as a distant ruler, but as the intimate source of all. Others turned to his moral teaching, with its emphasis on virtues as stable habits oriented toward true happiness, its refusal to reduce ethics to mere rules or to vague feelings. Still others found in his treatment of grace and charity a deep consolation. The idea that God's action in the soul does not crush freedom, but heals and elevates it. In time, the Church began to speak of him with special honor. He was recognized as a saint, not because he had written many books, but because he had lived a life of charity, humility, and devotion, because his learning had been offered as a service, not used as a ladder for pride. Later, he would be named a doctor of the Church, a doctor not in the modern sense of a medical title, but as a teacher whose doctrine had a healing, guiding force for the whole people of God. Yet for all these honors, his legacy retains a certain quietness. To open one of his works is not to step into a world of rhetorical flourish or emotional display. It is more like entering a cloister on a gentle afternoon, arches casting soft shadows on stone, a garden in the center, a fountain, perhaps, water falling in a steady, unobtrusive rhythm. Questions are arranged like the beds in that garden, each in its place, each connected to the others by deliberate paths. The walker can move without haste, resting when needed, always knowing that the path will lead somewhere. Part of the enduring calm of Thomistic wisdom lies in the way it views reality as fundamentally ordered and meaningful. For Thomas, the world is not a chaos of scattered fragments, but a creation shaped by the wisdom of God. The multiplicity of things, the variety of plants and animals, the diversity of human talents and cultures, the many branches of knowledge, does not threaten unity. It expresses it. The same God who is pure being, pure truth, pure goodness, has allowed these reflections of being, truth, and goodness to shine in different degrees in creatures. To study them, to understand them, is not to move away from God, but to come to know more deeply the one from whom they come. This vision offers, even now, a kind of inner rest to those who feel overwhelmed by the complexity of the world. In times when knowledge seems scattered into countless disciplines, when arguments clash loudly and conclusions shift like sand, Thomas's trust in the unity of truth can feel like a deep breath. He reminds his readers that, if something is truly known by reason, it cannot ultimately contradict what is revealed by faith, because there is only one author behind all that is real. Difficulties may arise from misunderstanding, from partial views, from our own limitations, but not from any crack in the truth itself. Another aspect of his lasting legacy is the way he treats those with whom he disagrees. In his writings, voices from many traditions appear: ancient Greek philosophers, Jewish and Muslim thinkers, earlier Christian theologians, even heretical movements. He gives them space, allows them to speak. He presents their positions clearly, often with more fairness than their opponents would grant them. Then he responds, not with scorn, but with careful reasoning. This intellectual charity is part of what makes his work feel calm, even when the questions are sharp. He shows that disagreement need not mean hostility, that one can honor truth wherever it appears, while still gently correcting what is incomplete or mistaken. For students and readers today, this approach remains a quiet school of humility. It suggests that one listens before judging, understands before refuting, and seeks the fragment of insight even in views one cannot ultimately accept. In a world where arguments are often quick and loud, Thomas's patience has its own quiet power. Within the Dominican order, his figure became a kind of steady star. Novices studied his works not as an imposed burden, but as a way of entering into the mind of one of their own who had walked the path before them. They learned from him how to join contemplation and preaching, how to think in the light of prayer, how to let the mysteries celebrated at the altar inform the questions posed in the classroom. His example reminded them that the preacher's word gains weight when it rises from a heart that has spent time at the feet of Christ in silence. Beyond the order, seminaries, universities, and schools adopted his thought as a central reference. Even in places where his system was not formally followed, echoes of his distinctions, his questions, and his careful balance between nature and grace, reason and faith, made their way into the intellectual atmosphere. The language he used, of act and potency, essence and existence, form and matter, became tools that others used, sometimes without even knowing from whom they had learned them. As philosophy and theology developed, many new voices emerged, some building on his work, others criticizing or departing from it. Yet even those who argued against him often found themselves shaped by his questions. It was as if he had set a pattern for thinking that could not easily be ignored, like the original lines of a drawing that remain visible even when later colors and shapes are laid on top. For ordinary believers, who might never open the Summa or read a commentary, his influence often arrived indirectly, through catechisms simplified from his teaching, through hymns he wrote for the Eucharist, through the way priests and teachers explained the faith after having themselves drunk from his clear wells. A child learning to say, "God made me to know him, love him, and serve him," was, in a simple formula, receiving something of Thomas's serene view of the human person's purpose, to move toward God in knowledge, and love. At the same time, his legacy extends beyond overtly religious contexts. Those who care about the dignity of the human person, about the reality of objective moral truth, about the possibility of rational discourse, often find in him a companion. His insistence that the human soul is spiritual and immortal, that the person is not reducible to matter, speaks quietly into a world that sometimes forgets these things. His insistence that freedom is not mere choice, but the capacity to choose the good, offers a path in times when liberty is often mistaken for license. Yet for all the breadth of his influence, the tone of his voice remains the same. Across the centuries, as new editions of his works were printed, as commentaries multiplied, as lectures were given in his name, the original character of his writing did not change. It continued to offer a gentle steadiness, like the presence of a wise, calm teacher who does not raise his voice, who does not dramatize, who simply lays out the truth as best he can, trusting that time and grace will do the rest. Perhaps this is the deepest part of the legacy of St. Thomas Aquinas, not only the content of his thought, but its atmosphere. To dwell for a while in his pages is to be reminded that thinking can be an act of peace, that seeking truth need not be frantic or anxious. One comes away from his works not with the sense that everything has been solved, he himself would never claim that, but with the sense that reality is intelligible, that God is trustworthy, and that our minds, however limited, are made to participate in a light that does not deceive. The calm of Thomistic wisdom, then, is not the calm of indifference, but of confidence. It is the stillness of a soul that knows it is rooted in God, that sees the world as a gift, that approaches difficult questions with both seriousness and serenity. It is the echo, in another register, of the quiet that once surrounded him as he knelt before the Eucharist, or as he walked slowly through cloisters and city streets, his thoughts lifted toward the one he longed to see face to face. Today, long after his lamp was extinguished in the small room at Fossa Nova, that light has not gone out. It lives in the minds he has helped shape, in the hearts he has strengthened, in the confidence he has given to countless readers who, opening his works in times of confusion, have found there a gentle guide. In the great unfolding story of the Church and of human thought, St. Thomas Aquinas remains a calm presence, a quiet, enduring witness to the possibility of loving God with all one's mind, and of finding in that love not restlessness, but a deep and lasting peace. If the quiet, steady life of St. Thomas Aquinas has kept you company tonight, you are welcome to return to this gentle light whenever you wish. If you'd like more peaceful journeys with the saints, you may choose to like this video and subscribe to our channel so their stories can continue to accompany your evenings. And in the comments, feel free to share which moment of Thomas's life touched you most, or where in the world you are listening from. We would be grateful to hear from you, softly, across the distance.